Okay, everyone, I'm back. Yeah, I just waited about 10 minutes for this sky and background to air dry. And it did, and I was happy to see that some of these clouds that I thought were a little too aggressive are not. They've faded into the background, so that's good. They're there, but not too big of a deal. So the sky isn't dry, but it's dry enough. I think I can come back in. I want to give just a little subtle bounce to this corner so that it pulls forward just a little. I'm using this cheap 1/2-inch flat. And now I'm also, before I move into the darkest darks, assessing the whole painting to see what else it might be telling me it needs. Fortunately, not too much, but a few little things jump out. This was one. I thought it needed a little bounce there. This closer building across the river, I don't want to add a lot of detail, so this is a bit, I don't want to say delicate. I mean, it's just a painting. What's the worst that can happen? You screw up a painting, but I think it needs a little bit of identity in some of these windows because they're a little prominent in the composition. So I'm using this Escoda Perla brush, very small flat brush. Such subtle stuff, but just little tiny bits of identity I think will help. It's the kind of thing though that you could so quickly and easily go too far. So I'm really being minimal and discreet about it. Judicious, I guess that's the word. Yeah, okay, a little of that goes a long way. Also, I think this is the kind of decision maybe best left to when I'm almost 100% done. But I think it's okay for now. I think it did need a little bit of textural anchoring on this side. But in just a moment, I'm gonna step away from the palette. This is less about building identity than it is about building a balance in the painting. Knowing how much busyness there's going to have here. I don't want an equal amount there, but I want some ballast over on this side of the painting to visually anchor and to set up this nice diagonality throughout the painting. I think a lot about that, these energies, the horizontal energy, the vertical energy in this painting is dominant because of the format and the way everything just sort of reaches up, connecting heaven and earth, water and sky. But then secondary, I think, is actually this diagonal energy that reads through, connecting all these different shapes and distances. And third and last probably is the horizontal. Anyway, so all these things run through my mind. Are they important? I don't know, they are to me. It just helps keep your painting more in balance and more dynamic than just filling in the dots and coloring every little thing you see. Okay, I have a theory for how I want to treat this bridge, but I'm not 100% sure how well it's going to work, but let's just give it a whirl. I'm going to give the whole face of the bridge, I don't want it terribly dark, but I want it darker than it is. So I'm going to build up some texture, tone, and value. So a medium-sized, smallish mop brush. This is pretty much clear water. I'm putting in the distant part of the face of the bridge. I'm having this idea that the deep shadow areas under the bridge may not necessarily be as dark as you would imagine. So that's pretty much just clear water. Now into that I'm going to drop some of this earthy light red. Not in a regular way, but I want it a little bit intentionally blotchy. Obviously what I'm trying to do is build up a gradual increasing intensity from the distance to the forward part of the bridge. So same thing here, but I'm using less water in the brush, more pigment. I don't know how much I want it to go toward this red, although I like the bounce between the teal and the red. But I don't want it to look as if it's painted red, so I think maybe that's enough. And this is Van Dyke Brown. Again, I'm painting with the side of the brush to try to get some of those intentional skip and jump marks to keep it very textural and suggestive looking. And then here at the very closest part of the bridge, while it's still quite wet, I'm dropping in some of the mineral violet. Use gravity to pull these wet washes around. So the intended effect is probably pretty obvious. If something is closer to you, especially on a foggy day, you're going to see it pick up more color, more detail, more specificity. And if something's farther away from you, the opposite will happen. It'll be harder to see, harder to focus on. And then the big effect for the whole painting that this will have, hopefully, is to establish that sense of a foreground, a midground, and a background. That sense of three-dimensionality that I love so much. There are these great little mini buttresses that stick out into the water here. So I'm back to the flat brush, but some of those same color story. The earthy red, the violets, the browns. Here, that effect is what I want, where these things just sort of melt off the page. I don't want all the clarity that's showing up here. Not sure that's working. So I think what I'll do is intentionally scruff up that edge. Even though it's in the foreground, the attention of this painting wants to be more up here, less down here. This will need to get darker, this underside of the bridge, but I, again, don't want it to be gloomy and very dark. I think I want a bounce of light here at the top, and then it'll get darker here along the edge of the painting. Before we are, for now, I think it's fine. This needs to set up a bit. Then I'll do the darker more colorful shading and shadowing under the bridge, but I want to wait a bit so I can keep a crisper edge there. If I start to introduce any more color there, I'll lose that edge altogether. So I have so many things running together, I think it needs some of this clarity to help make the whole thing make sense. Softer register, but back here, the same idea. Then I want to give some identity to the water surface, but I love painting water, but oh my gosh, is it an area where you can go so wrong so quickly. One of the lessons I learned in painting water is that it often needs way less attention than you think. Maybe, perhaps especially in the medium of watercolor. It's obviously a very fluid medium. So often, just letting the fluidity of the medium tell the story of a body of water is almost enough. You don't need too many colors, too many marks, too many brush strokes. I've looked back at some of my older paintings, 2 weeks old, and I've been horrified by how easily bodies of water, skies too, but bodies of water in particular can look overworked and heavy. When again, as I say, often just the fluidity of the medium is nearly enough to do all the work for you. Let the watercolor work for you. Don't fight it as much, and you're often much happier. So here with another inexpensive synthetic flat brush, I'm just scraping in a little bit of raw umber on that distant stairs going down and wall across the river, just to pull it slightly forward of that, but not too dark, so it still looks far away. But as this wall reaches down to meet the water, it's a little thing, but it's sort of important. I don't want that. I don't want a hard edge there. I want the bridge to just melt into the water surface. So that's just clear water. Now I'm going to go back to the small 1/8 inch flat brush. This is some Viridian. It's just a murky mess in my palette, so it may have some other tones in it. Started as Viridian, and I'm just going to drag across a few marks to connect that clear water to some tone. I'm doing it all in the horizontal axis to, if there are any brush expressions, they'll fall along the horizontal and hopefully look organic and intentional. Swapping out as I get closer to the 1/2 inch. Trying to be intentional and not overthink. That's where I always go wrong. So as I get closer, I drop just a little bit of cobalt blue into the Viridian just to deepen it ever so slightly. And then some violet at the very bottom. Anyway, quicker is better. Sloppier in this case is better. Brushing up to feather that into this buttress, just to conjoin all those elements. And even though that's very little work done on the water, I honestly think it's probably enough. I'm going to use the side of this flat brush to drop a little bit of this violet in, especially in the closer area, to help pull it forward and make this body of water look flat, not vertical. doesn't need a lot of identity. It was moving, but I don't want the River Seine to be the star of this show. Just another important cast member. Yeah, I think that's enough. You get the idea. Key here is one thing is a little drier than the next, so some blossoms can start to happen. The flat brush can kind of feather all those different areas together and do away with most of those nasty problems. Yeah, good enough. So obviously we're not done, but really the areas of the painting are starting to come together. The saturation on the foreground is really making it pull forward of the background, so it's the effect I want is starting to work. And then as this dries, I'll do a little bit a similar approach to what I did here by just using a small flat to indicate some details. Here I'll use a deeper tone to do something similar and probably a little bit more specific. Now it's time to begin thinking about the darkest darks. The face of the bridge is still too wet to add too much to it yet. This edge is still, it's almost dry enough where I can begin thinking about those deeper shadows under. But I think what I'll do now is some work up here. Start some of these light standards and the figures. I did literally nothing in this middle area, and informationally I think that's the way to go, but it looks a little wanting, a little blank. So I'm going to go back to my brush I used on my trees and add just a little extra layer of texture. Doesn't need a lot, but I think just a little in there will, again, help emphasize the sense of distance. Don't forget your thumb and your finger, the cheapest brush you can buy. You can sometimes just feather in a wash or an area like that so you don't have a clumsy looking edge. Yeah, that looks fine. Right, so I'm going to go with the, this is a number 4 Escoda Versatile brush. Just a very standard but beautiful round flat brush. There are figures here in the mid distance, so I'm going to use a bit of this mineral violet, not much water. I don't want them too dark, but I'm being a little bit careful. So you can see there's a hint of detail, but not all that much because they're not nearly as close as these are going to be. This middle ground light standard, I'm using the same. The small round brush helps me to paint little ideas of detail without getting too picky. But I don't want it too dark. This one will be very dark, this one lighter, that one lighter still, of course. But darker than what's behind, so it looks quite clearly forward of all of that stuff. The other thing, again, what helps make that effect work is the edges. This has a crisp edge. These trees do not. The building definitely doesn't. So the crisper edge you have on a thing, the closer it can tend to look. There are a million of exceptions to that, but that's a pretty safe rule of thumb. This more distant light, this is just raw umber, none of the violet, except a little bit that may still be lingering in my brush, I have to admit. So a little less detail, but a little bit, so it again looks forward, but not as forward as these. the bottom of this lamp, I'm going to soften it. So it's just a hint, but it should be enough. Now, the guy up front, I'm going to use right out of the tube neutral tint. I have a little bit of perylene green in my palette for some reason. I was using it for some painting recently, so this is just a deep, dusky green that I'm dropping into the neutral tint. So this is not black, but it's getting there. But it's a deep greenish gray, quite cool. And I'm being more careful with this light than I've been with anything yet, because as a thing, it has to anchor much of the right side of my painting. It also has to, even though it's thin and lacy, it has to carry a good amount of weight to anchor that side of the painting. So it's not a big bulky stone object. So to that end, it's going to have to be a little bit darker, a little bit more specific. Yeah, going with the deep green I think was the way to go, though it really doesn't matter that much. Really, the value is way more important than the color, as frankly is almost always the case. I really think, in my life at least, 90% of the time in painting, color is the question, and 90% of the time, value is the answer. The color almost always matters so much less than the value of whatever it is you're painting. We all love color, but it doesn't usually solve our problem. So on this globe here, I'm being a little bit precious, but so deep perylene greens, neutral tint, and a little of the cobalt teal to show some of the glass in the globe. It's just, maybe more than any other area of the painting, that needs to be pretty specific and nailed down. Another thing I love about painting, I mean, there's no one right way to paint. I keep saying it because it's true. But what I like in my paintings is a whole range of contrasts or dialogues almost. You know, the vertical versus the diagonal versus the horizontal, the dark versus the light, the warm versus the cool. And then here, the clarity versus obscurity. You can do that in watercolor so easily if you have the intention to do it, and it can just look so magical if it's done well and in the same painting. So across the expanse of your painting, you can have all these different kind of brush marks and expressions, and yeah, it's just fantastic. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't do that in oil painting, but for me, for some reason, watercolor painting, it just looks, there's just nothing else like it. It's quite amazing. I think the jump between this light and that's a little stark, so I'll use a little of this teal on this lamp too, the mid-ground creature, just to bring it a little closer to that and a little further from that. But I can see I'm getting a little carried away, so enough of that. While I was doing that, this bridge face, not dry, but dry enough that I think it can hold an edge. So I'm using this really nice quality flat perla by Escoda, a number 4, so it's pretty thin. And I'm going to use very little water, the dark Van Dyke brown. It's very intentional dry brush marks just up in this area. I don't want them to be solid. I want these skip marks that you can get with dry brush. So even in the foreground, a little bit of specificity and clarity can be enough. Often you don't need to detail everything. In fact, I really believe you should not. You don't want to tell the viewer everything. You want to imply some things. Allow the viewers to figure some things out. If you get good at that, you can build up this really nice dialogue with your viewer where they want to get invested in looking at your painting and trying to fill in the blanks and answer some questions for themselves. But if you delineate every little thing in the painting and leave nothing to the viewer's imagination, your painting can instantly start to look stiff and dry and technical. And I do not want that. So just sort of randomly, I'm adding some little smaller dark highlights, shadowed areas, that sort of thing. Again, I'm not going to do everything just because it's there, just here and there. Hopefully I'll get the balance right. Again, what I'm using for the most part here is a Van Dyke brown. As I get further down the river, I will use more water, less pigment, and probably introduce some, as I'm doing here, some umber, lighter, warm tones. Less. Trying to get the same Doppler effect that I got on my lamp standards. Kind of tricky to do. It's an easy concept to understand. But you can do it. If you just have the intention, it can work. Then the kind of brush marks you make varies as well. They're more specific, closer up to you, and more general as they get further away. Again, it shouldn't be mind-blowing, but it kind of is when you think that all this you're doing on a flat surface. But this really can start to look infinitely farther away than this can look so much farther away than that one. Really, the actual distance is just a few inches. But of course, that's the magic of art. All right, now I think the thing for me to do very soon is to address the tone I want under these arches. I have an intention, I have an idea in mind, but I'll confess I'm not 100% sure it's going to work well. But that's okay. I'll just pretend as if I think I know exactly what's going to happen, and isn't that the key? Just pretend you have confidence, and then it's often just as good as actually having it. Here in the foreground, before I get there, I'm wasting some time just adding some textural elements to some of this ancient stonework in the bridge. Again, I don't want to paint everything, just enough to add a sense of foreground texture here and a little bit here, but again, less and less as we get further into the distance. Right. These two arches, I think, they're not less important than this, but they're smaller, they're further away, so they're less dominant in the overall composition. So they need to be thought of more as just value exercises. That's a little bit of a yellow ochre washed down into some mid-tone brown, not very dark. It's okay. I'm obsessed with getting this idea of a little bit of bounce light off this river, so I'm going to try to do it here, and if that works, I'm going to do a more exaggerated version of it here in the foreground. So this is a brighter color for the time of day and the atmospheric effect of this painting. I don't want too much of that, but I think just a little. That is a Permanent Orange by Daniel Smith. Then I'm going to leaven it by dropping in a little of this teal. Yeah, that works. And then as we come down, a little of the Van Dyke brown. So sort of a strange, warm, cool, warm wash. I think it works well, but I think what doesn't work is the smaller, less important arch behind looks really out of place. So I'm going to drop a little bit of this dusky teal into it while it's still wet. And hopefully that will marry up with this one nicely. Isn't too bad, but I didn't use any of the orange in the distant one, and it looks a little too dark, so just overall going to lighten it, and some washed out orange bounce just there. I love this effect, but I'm also very aware that this introducing this bright color into this subtle palette painting could be risky, so I'm just trying to keep it pretty minimal. I think that's good. I think I like it. Right, now this character, the same effect but more of it. What could go wrong here, besides everything, is just doing too much. So again, this is that orange of Daniel Smith, a beautiful transparent color. It looks quite aggressive, but honestly, it's more of a warm tone, and as it dries, it looks much less acidically orange. It just gives an earthy, warm glow. Now while that's still wet, I'm going to wash it into some of this teal, which I love, and I love that combination of the orange and the teal. It's a warm, cool complement, but it's, again, kind of an off note. It's a minor key. It's not a major complement, but a minor one. And I like that effect. But I'm going to wash it down into some violet and then some of this the Van Dyke brown that I've been using here and there throughout. Because of the area, I'm using a little bit more pigment and a little bit more water. What I really want is for this whole lower part of the painting to melt into the overall surroundings. So I don't want too many edges showing. This edge I do want. Down here, no. I just want this to anchor the whole painting. Yeah, I like that effect. So again, you get the contrast of clarity and obscurity. And I think I need to bounce those reflections a little more anyhow. I'm going to go with a larger 3/4 inch versatile Escoda brush and carry this story across, but in a less aggressive way as we get toward the left side edge. I'm painting up from the bottom. This adds texture, value a little bit. Also a sense of reflection, sort of general reflection, and a little bit of anchor to the bottom. Looks pretty good, but I think even that's a little too strident at the very far edge, so I'll just soften that. Let all that jazz run together. At this stage of the painting, all the major elements are in, so you can start to analyze and study your intention and your balance to see if it's working. Overall, the answer is yes. I think I really like the way this is developing. Obviously, this and this look further away. I think in terms of, though, another consideration, overall balance of the painting. It's frustrating to say this, but I think top of this building does want to be bounced a little bit more. So it's frustrating because I think I didn't quite nail it. It's very nearly there. And I think of another consideration. I think introducing a little bit of the subtle teal into the top of that roof would not be a bad thing either, just to help marry the color palette of warm and cool throughout. But also adding just a tiny bit more value right here at the pinnacle. I love this effect. I think it's working. I think this more distant building, you could make an argument that it could use a little bit of this dry brush identity, but you could also argue it doesn't need anything else. But if you wanted a little additional texture, I don't think that would be so bad. So I could just scrape in a few generic marks for some of these dormers, cornices, and whatnot. Just very little. I love the subtlety of this painting, and subtlety can be the hardest thing sometimes to make work because it can be very powerful. But yeah, it resides in what you don't paint as much as in what you do paint, or in how little you paint something, how well it works. So while this is all drying, I will work on these remaining figures, which are important, but very smaller, less critical elements of the painting. So I often hold all my brushes I'm using in one hand, and I put them all down, and the reason I hold them in one hand is so I can find them, and I put them down and they vanish. So I was searching for this guy, but I found it. Okay, so these mid-ground figures need to be like these, but a little bit darker. You could even use them as an excuse to introduce some subtle color. So I'm dropping in a little bit of a ultramarine blue and maybe a little bit of that green, perylene green, keeping them in the cool family. But again, color is not critical here, value is. These need to be at the lighter range of the darkest dark, or at the darkest range of the mid-tone. But this one figure looking over the railing will be the darkest figure. Amount of area you're covering kind of affects the implied value too, meaning you could paint these very dark and they're not going to be that prominent because the area you're covering is so small. So you don't really need to worry about it all that much. Okay, this lonely guy here is standing on the edge, pondering his fate, staring down into the sun. I think it's a good chance to introduce a little bit of a jewel tone of color, but again, mostly his value is key. So I'm painting the top of his body with just a little water and pretty much solid neutral tint so that the edge of him will look quite dark. Then I think because I've fallen in love with it, I'll use a little bit of this teal, drop it into his coat he's wearing. So as long as the edge of this shape remains quite dark, you can drop in colors within the body of a shape and it will still read as quite dark. And even at that, he's small and not the central figure of the painting, but he is part of this overall dark, intricate shape. So, not too bad. This is not dry, but I think it's dry enough I can turn the painting over. And I think I'm going to use the round brush here. This is just clear water for now. And I'm just doing this so I don't end up with a hard edge, and then I can start dropping in some tone and it'll bleed together nicely. So this is some more of that teal that I'm just going to use on the very pinnacle of this one building. Not very dark, slightly darker than it was because it's any pigment's going to make it slightly darker, but a little bit darker, little bits more color, the very peaks a little bit more violet. Keep that going around. The actual roof is slate, I believe, if I remember the photo, which I haven't looked at, but I will in a minute. So I think this bluish green color is also appropriate if you're a fan of reality, which I'm not especially, but I do have to consider it now and then. Then at the very top, just a tiny bit darker, so I'm using some violet, and there's also just a little bit of French ultramarine in my brush, which I didn't plan, but looks kind of good, so I won't take it out. All that said, I'm really aware that I could go too dark pretty easily, so I'm trying to not do that. Wondering if I've overdone it. I don't think so. Just in terms of the acreage or square footage of the painting, big portion of it is here, which is one reason I darkened the sky a little earlier on. So the point is just the amount of space of the painting this corner takes up deserves a bit more attention just to help anchor everything. So yes, I think that's generally better. It's maybe 1% too dark, but I think it will dry just fine. I like how the water turned out. It looks like water, but it's very minimal. I like generally how all this turned out. I think this edge could have a slight more bounce of contrast. I like that orange glow, so I think the stone could get a little darker, which I will do when it dries a bit more. Then I'm wondering, though I love this light glow through the middle, if another tree wouldn't be well advised poking in on this far corner just to help anchor that and soften that edge. It's a minor thing, easy enough to do. I don't think there's actually a tree there, but who cares? Again, I put my brushes down and can't find them. Here it is. Okay, here's that liner brush I was using. This is some raw umber. I think some additional texture will not be a bad thing here. I really just don't want to go overboard on these trees and get too specific or detailed. Just the idea of trees. Yeah, I think that's better. It helps continue the narrative throughout, left to right. Little bits of Van Dyke brown. So I don't know if there's a teaching moment here, if it's helpful. I try very hard not to think too much about specific, the reality of specific elements or items. But at this stage, I'm just thinking about the balance of the whole painting. What does the painting need? It needed a little value there, it needed a little value up here. So again, I'm not looking at the reference photo. I'm not trying to be true to that version of reality that shows up in a reference photo. I'm trying to be true to the reality of my painting. What is it my painting needs, if anything? But I can tell you, the reference photo is generally not the place you go to find that answer. You have to look at your intention for the whole painting. Does the painting work? What does the painting need? I think it did need that, but again, a little too strong, a little too illustrative. So I'm just going to feather it while it's still wet. Better already. Now I want to just deepen that edge just a little, and then I think that's going to be the last thing I'm going to do. For that, I'll go to my 1/2 inch flat. I have these beautiful Escoda 1/2 inch, which I do use a lot, but generally, because they're higher quality, they hold so much water. They make much more beautiful, long shapes. But for a smaller painting like this is a quarter sheet, so it's not very big. Everything's a little bit more contained in terms of space, so sometimes these fully synthetic brushes work a little bit better. Yeah, just a little additional value on that top edge of that, I think helps that bounce a little. That looks good. And as a lesson, I'm going to call it a day. I hope you've enjoyed this. This tree on the left is bothering me. I'm glad I did it, but I don't feel like I nailed the value quite right, so I'm going to soften the bottom. Just wanted it to be a very neutral texture. Oh yeah, much better. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. Oh, I'll show you the reference photo from where I started. So obviously I made some changes. I changed the horizon, lowered it so that I could look up at the railing a little bit rather than down on it. So I wouldn't, I didn't want to paint the street and the street traffic. I wanted to give a little bit more drama and focus to these people walking along the edge. So lowered the perspective, looked up at the railing, gave these a little more height and presence. And then the main thing I wanted to do was just tell the story, the experience of a foggy, misty, slightly rainy day in Paris where, yes, very beautiful and romantic city. People say that because, for a reason, it is. But as a painting, this sense of things being in front of other things, that mystery and surprise you get on a foggy day where things just emerge out of the mist, grow out of the fog, and make wandering around a great city like this so much fun and so much a life-affirming experience. That's what this painting was, in its small, humble way, trying to do. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you picked up a few tips of things to do, or maybe not to do. That's okay too. And thank you for joining me, and happy painting. See you soon.